NATO foreign ministers are on their way to Prague for a meeting focused on Ukraine. In recent weeks, Russia has made some of its most significant gains since invading in 2022. And this week, France and Germany both announced Ukraine is allowed to use supplied weapons to strike inside Russia. This is a break with where the U.S. stands, and Canada appears to side with its European allies.
We need to be forward-leaning on this question. Why? Because Russia has no red line. And so that is why we need to make sure that when it comes Ukraine's defense, that we're there to help them, and that we show that notwithstanding what is happening, that we're by their side. And there's, in Canada, no condition on end-user shipment of arms to Ukraine, and that is why we will continue to work with Ukrainian armed forces.
Retired General Tom Lawson is a former chief of the defense staff for the Canadian Armed Forces, and he joins me now. General Lawson, it's good to see you. Thanks for joining us.
Pleasure, David.
You just heard Mélanie Joly's response there to a reporter asking about whether Canada is on board with France and Germany in allowing weapons it supplies to Ukraine to hit military sites inside Russia. Certainly, what Canada was able to give is not enough to tip the balance of this conflict. But what message do you think this all sends to other members of NATO, in particular the U.S.?
Right. Well, I think what it's saying is that there is an increasing concern in NATO and elsewhere that Russian momentum threatens to overcome Ukraine defenses, and it's not beyond the pale to think that there's a possibility that Ukraine could fall. Whereas NATO members have all been very, very concerned about what red lines might be out there that the Russians have set over the last couple of years, now the real risk is what happens if Russia is able to increase their momentum and this whole thing falls apart.
I mean, just operationally, and if Russia is able to put its artillery and its troops on one side of the Russia-Ukraine border and fire at critical infrastructure and civilian targets and military targets from sanctuary, essentially, because Ukraine is limited in its ability to fight back, can Ukraine win that fight? It seems like an impossibility to an amateur like me.
Well, there was some hope in the spring after the Russian attack had been blunted and had been fairly stable for a year and a bit, that Ukraine would be able to develop with the weapons that were coming in and with their training, develop some momentum that would simply push the Russians back to their sanctuary. But your point gets to an even bigger one. How did Russian territory become sacrosanct? How did it become a sanctuary? And there is one simple answer for that, and it's because Russia said it was sacrosanct. And the problem for NATO is that as soon as Russia says something is a red line, NATO has to take that into consideration because the leader may or may not be fully rational, and they were quick to throw around the nuclear weapon trump card that nobody was quite certain they might use. So there's nothing legal about this sanctuary that Russia's talking about, but it has, for the last couple of years, concerned NATO members, and now maybe there are bigger risks that are starting to turn that concern.
I get the argument that who knows what Putin's state of mind is, and of course Russia is a nuclear power, and those are very complicating factors in this. But in sort of the laws of war, we've talked a lot about what's happened with Gaza, that Israel has a right to defend itself in accordance with the laws of war, and as such, you know, there is a tolerance by some countries who are in NATO for what Israel is doing in Gaza and firing into Lebanon and other places like that. How would the laws of war apply to a situation where Ukraine, which was invaded, were to shoot back into Russia? Like, legally it would be allowed? It's more the moral weight of NATO holding them back? How do we interpret that?
That's well put. That's well put, what you just said there. Legally, as long as those targets are valid military targets, Ukraine stands on firm ground.
Right.
So, as I say, the only reason that NATO has put limitations, and Ukraine has followed those limitations for fear of losing those lines of weaponry and even those allies at some point, is because of the concern of these red lines. So no, there is absolutely nothing other than Russian threats that hold Ukraine from moving across their operations across the border into Russia. And we've seen over the last year and a half, in increasing numbers, still very few, attacks on Russian infrastructure, oil depots, things like that, in behind Russian lines that Ukraine really is loath to take responsibility for.
Right. These are like sabotage acts, drone attacks, and things which they sort of use a plausible deniability, so they can't be targeted with it, and may not have used Western-provided or NATO-provided technology. But from a tactical and strategic sense, if Ukraine were to get the green light, because they've struggled with air superiority, obviously in Ukraine, and with air defense because of what's happening, but if they're given permission to start hitting these Russian targets inside Russian territory, what does that do for Ukraine's ability to sort of push back and better protect its civilians and its infrastructure from what Russia has been doing?
It's very important. To your point you made a couple of minutes ago, when you can only play up to, for instance, in a metaphor, center ice, you're playing defense all the time. You can push the other team back to center ice, but you're not going to score any goals. As soon as you're bringing that weaponry to bear on valid military targets, either a little ways or very deep into Russian territory, it changes that calculus in a big way. And Russian leaders now know that the war is being seen and felt by Russian civilians in their own on their own territory. So it brings a whole new calculus to the Russian side, and probably eases pressure that the Ukrainian soldiers are feeling in around Kharkiv and the Donetsk region.
So Canada, which, there's some howitzers and the promise to buy a NASAM, which would be able to fire in the Russian territory should it ever be delivered because of the procurement and supply chain challenges there. It says go ahead. France was very explicit today, President Macron was, on a state visit to Germany. Germany not quite as boisterous as France, but moving in that direction. The U.S., though, is the linchpin in this, and there's been reporting in the New York Times and in other places that they are reconsidering their policy of telling President Zelensky not to do this, and it's maybe Secretary of State Antony Blinken and his department that is trying to drive this change. Where do you think this goes? There's a series of NATO meetings leading up to the Washington, D.C. Leader Summit in July, which is a long time in that conflict. Do you think the U.S. will eventually relent here? Because President Zelensky's pleas are getting pretty loud and persistent on this.
Right. So, and we can add Poland and Finland to the countries that are now taking off all limits. And you make a good point. The Canadian weaponry, which is very important. The Canadian contributions have been very good, really are not the ones that need limitations taken off. These, these HIMARS missiles that have come from the States, the rocket systems, artillery and artillery rounds could well do damage inside Russia. So that's real. But it will be things like the fighter jets that Ukraine is getting from Belgium, Denmark, Norway, and are right now limited to flying over only Ukrainian territory, that when those limitations come off, all of the tactics and operations that are being planned by Ukrainian military leaders on behalf of the strategies that Zelensky and the political leadership want to blunt the Russian attack and turn it around, become far simpler. Right now, they've got a matrix they've got to lay out on the table every time they start to develop an operational plan and check to see which weapons systems and weapons can be used if indeed they press across Russian border. When you take those limitations off, as we're seeing more and more nations doing, that becomes a simpler and simpler task. To your point about the United States, I actually think that they are asking nations like Canada to throw up these trial balloons and see what sort of response comes back from Russia. I think that this is in anticipation of what's going to take place in Washington in July at that summit.
Yeah, that was interesting. I had that suspicion myself when I started to see this cascade, because it makes it potentially easier for the president to go there. Retired General Tom Lawson, really appreciate the time. Thanks for joining us today.
Thanks very much for having me.